And finally, Kim Kardashian is feeling more confident than ever, and she's not afraid to hint at why. It's a fresh chapter for Kim, one marked by independence, style, and a whole lot of self-assurance.
Okay, stop scrolling. If you think the Kim and Kanye narrative is exhausted, think again. Kim just dropped a French Vogue cover and an interview that reads like a mic drop. And yes, there is a shade aimed at Ye, even if she never says his name out loud. This isn't petty tabloid fodder. It's a cultural pivot moment where a woman famously linked to a megastar reclaims the conversation on her own terms, dresses the part, and lets the optics do the talking. Kim didn't scream his name. She didn't post a side-eye meme. Instead, she pasted like a masterclass in tone, measured, elegant, and knowing. That's modern celebrity messaging. You don't need to shout to land a blow if your reputation does the heavy lifting. Kim's language in Vogue France is deliberate. It radiates the kind of calm that follows a deliberate disentangling. The choice of the word exhilarating is a color kept off the palette for a long time in her public life. And when someone who has been the subject of relentless scrutiny uses a single, optimistic adjective, it reads like a strategic pivot more than a stray feeling. If you want to understand why a line like that feels loaded, rewind. Kim filed for divorce from Kanye West in February 2021, after nearly 7 years of marriage, and the split was finalized about a year and a half later. It was a long, messy, litigated drift into separate public lives. That procedural fact, the paperwork and the timelines, matters because it frames every post-divorce soundbite. People tracked the dates and settlements like a tennis match because the logistics of separation shape the pace of narrative and how quickly either party can properly claim a new chapter. Within that unraveling were cultural flashpoints that now read like folklore. Kanye's well-documented insistence on shaping Kim's wardrobe and image, a control that she has since framed as something she resisted and later reclaimed. In interviews and public recollections, Kim has pointed to a time when her look was a matter of negotiation, criticism, and even destruction. There are stories, repeated in outlets, about significant purges of clothing and sharp judgments about what she should and shouldn't wear. Those anecdotes landed as shorthand in tabloids. Relationship power plays translated into closets emptied and choices questioned. The fashion element here is not window dressing, it is the through line. Celebrity is often a choreography of image, and for Kim, fashion has been the arena where authority was contested. Mode and wardrobe choices were not neutral. They were battlegrounds for messages about sex, agency, and control. Kanye's critiques of Kim's too sexy looks were widely reported, and anecdotes of him discarding hundreds of her shoes became shorthand in tabloids for an iron-fisted influence. So when Kim credits a creative director or describes her independence as exhilarating, it's not mere vanity. It's a statement against a decade-long set of creative dynamics. This is where a subtle jab stops being personal gossip and starts functioning as cultural punctuation. The message is about sovereignty. Who gets to decide what a public woman wears, says, and embodies? For years, Kim's narrative was entangled with Kanye's, and that entanglement meant that every outfit carried a subtext. A dress was never only a dress, it was a communique. So the new language, I make my own choices, recalibrates the discourse. It tells fans, fashion editors, and the market at large that the aesthetic authorship has shifted, and that matters in the currency economy of celebrity. And profit matters here. Kim's brand engines, skims, fragrance lines, appearances all depend on a market that sees her as authentic. Authenticity sells, but it's also a currency in a post-influencer era where manufactured narratives are visible at a glance. Claiming autonomy is both a personal victory and a recycling of commercial capital. If Kim is the architect of her aesthetic, she controls the narrative, the collaborations, and the scarcity. That turns personal agency into economic leverage, a pivot from being an accessory in someone else's creative narrative to owning the intellectual property of her image. Let's talk optics. Demna and Balenciaga are not incidental names dropped for drama. they're signifiers. Demna's aesthetic is minimal, often austere, and his design language offers power through understatement. For Kim to credit Demna is to align herself with a certain cultural lineage, one that praises restraint over spectacle. That alignment is a calculated rebrand that also functions as a rebuke to an earlier era where spectacles sometimes equaled validation. In other words, Kim isn't just getting a new stylistic compass. She's publicly associating herself with a mode of fashion that confers a certain kind of authority. And there is a delicious irony in the way Kanye's post-split public life has unfolded. West, who was once framed as the auteur of both sound and image in their relationship, has since married Bianca Censori, whose own fashion choices and public appearances have proven provocative and headline-making, sometimes under Kanye's explicit encouragement. That contrast sharpens the meaning of Kim's comments. Where his current creative orbit embraces revealing, boundary-pushing looks from Bianca, Kim's renaissance is being framed around restraint and curation. The difference in aesthetic philosophies between the two camps reads like a public dialogue about taste, agency, and the optics of liberation. This split in aesthetic philosophy isn't neutral. It has consequences for gendered narratives about power. When a man dictates restraint for his partner's sexuality, but then champions the same in a new partner under the guise of art or liberation, that's not a coincidence. It's a recurring pattern worth parsing. The cultural conversation around who gets labeled empowered or objectified is messy and hypocritical, especially when the same person occupies both roles in succession. Kim's quiet declaration of autonomy reframes that hypocrisy as a public, teachable moment. There's also a lineage here of Kim leaning into fashion as an agency. Long before the divorce, her wardrobes were statements, sometimes controversial, sometimes masterful. The Met Gala outfits, the Balenciaga shows she walked, and her role in the fashion economy are parts of her ongoing assertion of taste-making power. The narrative shift from being curated to curating is meaningful because it reframes her from subject to auteur. It means that when Kim chooses a Balenciaga or a clean-lined Demna-adjacent silhouette, it reads as a considered rhetorical act, a statement to editors and consumers alike. But the story is messy because public memory is messy. The tabloids have a long memory, and the internet even longer. When Page 6 highlights the swipe, it is because the subtext is irresistible. Audiences love the arc where a public figure reclaims voice after an enforced era of criticism. Still, there's a difference between reclaiming and recrafting a narrative for consumption. Kim knows both worlds. She's an expert at packaging vulnerability as empowerment and then monetizing the aftermath. That dynamic complicates the purity of any single quote. Context is everything. Let's not pretend this is purely a personal feud resolution. This is also a case study in modern PR choreography. Kim's Vogue France interview is a masterclass in timing. To say you're exhilarated at a moment when the fashion season is in full view maximizes cultural resonance. It hits magazines, it hits fashion weeks, and it filters down to the influencer economy. In short, it's a narrative deployed across multiple markets: emotional, artistic, and commercial. And it works because it's credible. Kim's recent runway appearances and brand work give the line weight. There's a theater for confession in celebrity culture. Confessions that read like clarifying essays are currency. Kim's mention of not giving a fuck about critics is a wink to anyone who's watched a celebrity ascend from reality TV royalty to global commerce architect. It's also a subtle rebuke to those who would reduce her to the sum of relationships rather than the sum of work. By tracing her confidence to creative collaboration rather than romantic partnership, she modernizes the storyline from rescued by love to refined by craft. For younger women watching, the cultural stakes are real. There's a lesson in claiming authorship, that your aesthetic, career, and public persona can be sovereign. That lesson is impactful because it reframes the discussion of agency from intimate relationships to structural power within industries. Kim's pivot tells younger audiences that alliances with brands, designers, and creative directors can be emancipatory in ways that romantic entanglements may not be. That shifts where mentorship and influence actually matter in a career. Critics will call it a rebranding exercise, and some of that is fair. Celebrity statements are oligopolies of attention. They are negotiated, packaged, and sold. But there is a plausible authenticity here. Kim's recent runway appearances, her more curated editorial presence, and her business moves aren't only media stunts. They are sustained practices. You can't fake runway credibility forever. The fact that she cites creative mentors rather than romantic critics gives the rebirth a lineage that reads as more than a press cycle hiccup. Then there's the performative doubling that celebrity cultures love. Every public line invites a counterline. Kanye's camp and fans are likely to read this as petty or opportunistic, while Kim loyalists will call it self-actualization. Both are true in ways. The public's appetite for drama allocates meaning like currency. The more we argue, the more the narrative grows. For Kim, that visibility is neither purely surplus nor accidental. It's part of how celebrity economies expand. The jab, if it is one, also functions as content for a broader cultural conversation. Let's zoom out and consider the marketplace implications. Fashion editors, brand directors, and retail partners are watching. Kim repositioning herself as a voice of refined minimalism changes her desirability matrix. Brands that previously approached her as an accessory to another artist's vision might now approach her as the primary collaborator. That shift increases her negotiation power in collaborations, gives her greater say over campaigns, and enhances the long-term value of her personal brand. The stakes are literal. This is about where partnership dollars land. Power and image in celebrity life are never purely personal. They're social contracts. The public invests attention like capital, and celebrities spend it to produce cultural products. When Kim says she's exhilarated by her autonomy, she's not only staging personal liberation, she's reshaping the terms of that contract. It says, "My choices now reflect my intentions," and those intentions will be the ones other people read, interpret, and buy into. That recalibration changes the cultural grammar around celebrity authorship. Also worth noting, the gentle jab functions as a rhetorical move to redirect narratives about blame and growth. By framing her evolution around creative mentorship rather than romantic friction, Kim reframes any historical narrative of victimhood into one of collaboration and learning. That's a savvy rhetorical pivot. It avoids huskier accusations and instead emphasizes creative lineage. It's cleaner, and it's harder to attack. And for all the talk of agency, we should remember the marketplace that undergirds all this commentary. Kim's enterprises, beauty, shapewear, and licensing depend on audiences that buy into her taste. When she asserts independence, it isn't a private epiphany, it's an investment signal. Brands and partners take cues from these statements because they map onto consumer desires. If Kim is styling herself through minimalism, expect catalogs, collaborations, and campaigns to follow, quick and hard. There's also an element of emotional pedagogy here. Kim's narrative invites other public women to reimagine their transitions as projects, not tragedies. We live in a culture that commodifies pain into content, but Kim's language leans into a different model: pain as material for refinement. That's a nuanced framing that both complicates and redeems celebrity catharsis. It doesn't erase the fact of the breakup or the drama. It reorients the aftermath toward craft and continuity. Of course, the old grievances won't vanish. Paparazzi archives are stubborn. Old headlines, the fashion fights, the public arguments, the infamous moments that landed on late-night monologues will keep surfacing as counter-evidence to reinvention. But reinvention in celebrity is not about denial. It's about accumulation. Kim layers new chapters over old headlines, and in doing so, she increases the density of her persona. That complexity, paradoxically, makes her more interesting to cultural producers and consumers alike. Another angle to consider: public gender dynamics and criticism. Men who change aesthetic direction often get labeled innovative or complex, while women shifting styles are sometimes reduced to being difficult or attention-seeking. Kim's measured statement about independence nudges against that bias. It demands that we read a woman's stylistic sovereignty as an intellectual and commercial choice, not a melodramatic whim. That correction matters in the broader cultural project of how we allocate serious respect. And then there is the audience reaction type that matters most: the fashion community. Designers, editors, and stylists monitor these shifts because they tell them where cultural capital is migrating. Kim's newfound aesthetic position could tip late-season trends toward restraint, driving editorial spreads and retail assortments toward the quiet luxury she praises. Trends often have little to do with taste and more to do with who gets assigned authority. Kim staking claim to a sober, powerful aesthetic could redistribute that authority. But let's keep it real. Celebrity reinventions are never immaculate. They'll be messy, awkward, and occasionally cynical. Kim will still have PR teams, analytics, and quarterly sales reports whispering in her ear. Yet, there's a credible through line. Her recent public appearances, runway walks, and the collaborations she cites are not overnight phenomena. They are cumulative, which lends them authenticity. When a narrative is credible, even if it is curated, it holds more cultural weight than a sudden, self-conscious image flip. There's also a human element, and we shouldn't completely monetize it. People grow, people change, and some of that change is private and messy and real in ways that PR can't fully manufacture. Kim's voice in Vogue France reads in part as a personal inventory, acknowledgement of past constraints, credit to creative mentors, and celebration of reclaimed decision-making. There's room to accept that narrative on its own terms without collapsing it into either pure authenticity or pure strategy. Still, the choreography is fascinating. Kim's line invites Kanye's orbit to respond, and the media ecosystem will happily oblige. Comparisons will be made, styles will be contrasted, and each camp will produce think pieces. That's how these cultural narratives proliferate. For every Vogue line, there will be an opposite op-ed. For every understated runway moment, there will be an over-the-top counterpoint. That duel creates attention and thus value for both camps, which is the engine of celebrity. So what does it really mean? On the surface, it's a carefully worded personal update. Beneath, it's a strategic repositioning in which fashion, commerce, and autonomy intersect. It signals Kim moving from being co-authored to being the author of her public aesthetics. It signals the reallocation of cultural capital from one relationship dynamic to a new constellation of creative partnerships. And it signals to the industry that Kim isn't following another person's aesthetic directives anymore. She's set her own table. The cultural stakes are bigger than a single Instagram caption or magazine line. This is about how we assign agency and authorship in celebrity culture. It's about whether a woman's public taste is treated as an independent statement or merely a reflection of the men in her orbit. By claiming exhilaration and crediting creative mentors rather than romantic critics, Kim edits that script. She reframes her narrative from one of being guided to one of guiding. One more layer matters: the co-parenting reality that undergirds these public pronouncements. Kim and Kanye share 4 children, daily routines, and legally negotiated responsibilities that force a level of public restraint even when private feelings flare. Divorce didn't flip a switch. It set up a framework, custody schedules, settlements, and the logistics of shared life that makes grandstanding costly and clumsy. That constraint shapes rhetoric. Short, controlled statements land better than theatrical tirades because they preserve cooperative ground. Public appeals to growth therefore serve both personal narrative and practical purpose. They smooth the terrain for children, brand partners, and courts. Fans often forget that celebrity power is not only performance, but also infrastructure. Teams, lawyers, designers, and PR strategists all translate emotion into statements that can be enacted without derailing family obligations. In that light, Kim's measured exhilaration reads as both real feeling and strategic stewardship of a complicated household economy. That's part of her calculus. Here's the final truth. The public loves a comeback, but it loves a comeback with a moral. Kim's arc, from reality star to global entrepreneur, from spouse to sovereign tastemaker, fits a satisfying story arc. The Vogue France line is a new beat in that song. Whether you call it a subtle jab or a measured claim, it lands because it is believable, rooted in documented history, and amplified by smart timing. It repurposes past grievances into a future-facing brand, and it invites us to reconsider who gets to be the narrator in modern celebrity stories. Now go watch the interviews, read the Vogue piece, and keep your radar tuned. Fashion and power are doing their old dramatic pas de deux again. But this time, Kim's choreography looks like it's leading. If you liked this unpacking, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which Kim look, old school or new minimalism, you think packed the biggest cultural punch. We'll keep watching who wins the quiet wars of style, one carefully chosen sentence at a time.